Okay, so I want to take us through today general remarks, utilitarianism chapter 1, and what utilitarianism is. You're obviously writing your thoughts at the bottom here of your sheets, or they're obviously in your assignment folder, and you need to simply add in your comments. So what's Mill's purpose in these general remarks? He's kind of setting up the argument. He's moving towards a proof of utilitarianism and looking at the kind of epistemology behind that. How do you base a proof? One of the things he's going to point out is that we're after a kind of first principle, a summum bonum, as Kant calls it, the ultimate good, a foundation of morality. And one of the things that he's going to point out about Kant is that Kant himself, he says, one of the most illustrious of philosophers, was seeking a universal first principle. And his was, so act that the rule on which thou actest would admit of being adopted as a law by all rational beings. But he says that Kant smuggles in consequences into his system. Now, there's this famous example of the philosopher Constance, who puts the example of a Benjamin Constant in 1797. He writes to him and says, the moral principle that is one's duty to speak of the truth, if it were taken unconditionally, would make all society impossible. We have the proof of this from the very direct consequences which have been drawn from the principle by a German philosopher, who goes so far as to affirm that to tell a falsehood to a murderer who asked us whether our friend of whom he was in pursuit had not taken refuge in our house would be a crime. Right? So you've got a duty to tell the truth, says Kant, regardless of the consequences. And Kant's reply is, if you lie, and your lie hinders a man who's now planning a murder, you're legally responsible for the consequences that stem from that. If you've strictly adhered to the truth, my father is in the house when the murderer is knocking at the door, you're legally responsible for all the consequences that follow from that. If you'd strictly adhered to the truth, public justice could find no fault with you with the unforeseen consequences. The murderer comes in, he does his wicked deed, you're scot-free because you couldn't have foreseen the consequences. However, he says, it's possible that while you honestly answered yes to the murderer's question, whether his intended victim is in the house, the latter may have gone out unobserved and so have come in the way of the murderer, and the deed, therefore, would not have been done. So unbeknown to you, your father's taken a runner out the back door of the house, there's no consequences negatively that follow from it because he's not in the house. Whereas if you had lied and said he was not in the house and he really had gone out, but unknown to you, the murderer met him as he went and executed his purpose on him, then you might justly be accused of the cause of his death. If you'd spoken the truth and you knew it, perhaps the murderer, while seeing for his enemy in the house, might have been caught by the neighbours coming up and the deed prevented. Now, what he's saying here is, whoever tells a lie, however good his intentions may be, must be answerable for the consequences of it. So Mill is going to say that this is ridiculous because on page 183, it leads to outrageously immoral rules of conduct, and the consequences are not ones that you could adopt. No one could live by this because we do ultimately want to move aside from pain and move towards pleasure. And there is a kind of consequentialism smuggled in the back door to Kant's reasoning here. He's still kind of thinking, you can't do this because look what would follow from it. So the proof that Mill is after is a first principle that we seek pleasure. Pleasure is complex. It's not as simple as Bentham has presented it as a purely quantitative thing. It's qualitative as well. And pleasure can encompass virtues. It can encompass motives. It can encompass character. All of those things are useful in promoting pleasure and minimizing pain. But the ultimate spring and motivation of morality is going to be ultimately in this first principle of pleasure. And he's saying that right back at the beginning of philosophy, when Socrates was listening to Protagoras, they were disagreeing over what was the basis, the first principle of morality. And he says in science, that's, we work inductively. We don't kind of start from first principles. Otherwise, we'd never get even underway with algebra, he says. We start with experience, people's experience, and then we build up evidence and examples of that, and then we develop hypotheses and models, and ultimately we come up with scientific theory. So he's suggesting that his project is to find some end to which all our actions are aimed, and everything else is subservient, comes after. What is the test that we can seek? And he says, really, the big opponents of his day were intuitivists, people who thought that there was an innate kind of conscience that just gave us intuitive senses of right and wrong. And he thinks that this is incredibly abstract. It's like the fictions of English law and the mysteries of theology. It's really without much basis. The only way forward is this scientific kind of method of inductive thinking, where we go off human experience and we gather a sense of what's right and wrong. We work through observations, through the gathered experience of time. And as we do that, we're going to find a tacit influence of a standard that men's sentiments, men's feelings move towards, both in terms of favor, what they want, and aversion, what they're trying to avoid. And what we see is that it's the effects of things upon their happiness. The principle that Bentham put forward as the greatest happiness principle. This has a large share in the moral doctrines, even of those who are scornful towards it. And Kant is an example of it here. Why should you not tell a lie to a murderer at your doorstep? Because you're then responsible for the consequences of it. It's pursuing pleasure, avoiding pain is, as he puts it, kind of smuggled in there, and it may be regarded scornfully, but it's still responsible for a large share of our thinking. So he doesn't have much time for Kant in this respect. He's moving towards a proof. Whatever can be proved to be good and shown to be the case. So what is good about medicine? What is the end that medicine aims towards? It's health. It's the consequences of health. We judge whether bloodletting or mercury treatments are good or bad in terms of their consequences for health. They're not, so we abandon them in the Middle Ages, or the late Middle Ages. We judge, however, that treating a wound or raising and putting pressure on a limb that is bleeding has good consequences for health, and therefore that is how medicine evolves. And we like music because it brings us pleasure, and that's what promotes it. We have a rational faculty, we have an intellect, and our experience when we observe things and use our intellect shows us that the consequences of actions are aimed at pleasure. Now, what he's going to go on and do in chapter 2 is to address a whole range of objections to this, that it's swinish morality, that it's just kind of pursuing pleasure, or that it's the hedonic paradox, that the more you pursue pleasure, the more it moves away from you. He's going to try and meet every single objection and knock them down one after another, like a philosopher should. So he's anticipating the objections to his system and meeting them with logic and argument. So this first chapter is really setting up the argument. Can we find a summum bonum, a highest good, a set of first principles that we should aim for? How do we prove that the intuitionists, people who believe that we just innately have this conscience, this sense of right and wrong, it's quite mysterious, but we just have it all in us, hardwired. How do we kind of demythologize that, show it to be a myth, and in its place put something far more inductive, more scientific, that's based upon observation and almost the experiment of the whole human race, and what it inclines towards and why it sets up that purpose. And he's going to set up this principle of utility and say that even other philosophies like virtue ethics or Kantian ethics, they kind of, as we've seen here, they smuggle in through the back door consequentialist forms of reasoning. And he's asking, can we find up a proof that would establish utilitarianism? This is not going to be possible in the ultimate sense, but in a narrow sense, you can establish a proof. You can kind of look at human behavior and what it aims towards, and in doing so, you can find that. So we're just going to pause in a minute. I'm just going to come back in a second.